too serious, guys.
We are live. Go ahead.
So good afternoon to everybody, and good night to our guest speakers, Guido Caniglia and Roberto Gatti. We are okay. So good afternoon to everyone. So we are I and Guido are based in Vienna, and Roberto is based in France, so it's 9 time for us, and it's actually a holiday here, so it's a double thank you to our guest speakers. My name is Marco Viana Franco. I'm a postdoc fellow at the Konrad Lorenz Institute, also a researcher at Fundação João Pinheiro. And I will be the moderator / speaker in this 8th plenary session of the 5th National Meeting of Industrial Economics and Innovation, organized by the Brazilian Association of Industrial Economics and Innovation. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the president of the Brazilian Association of Industrial Economics and Innovation, Professor Lia Razenclever, the president and vice president of the organizing committee, Professors Márcia Siqueira Rapini and Eduardo da Mota Albuquerque, who is actually the original architect of this session. And yeah, I would like to thank them for such a kind invitation and a chance to engage with this community on common scientific interests. I think there was some background noise, but now we're back. I also like to greet the host institutions, the Faculty of Economic Science of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, in the name of its director, Professor Hugo da Gama Cerqueira, my friend and dear PhD supervisor, and also the Center for Development and Regional Planning, in the name of its director, Professor Federico Gonzaga Jaime Jr. This is also always delightful to be somehow close, even if far away from one's alma mater and old friends and colleagues. And again, it's very special thanks to our guests, Roberto Gatti and Guido Caniglia, for agreeing to participate in this event. I really appreciate it. So the title of this session fits well into the theme of this event. It is Diversity Lost, COVID-19 as a Phenomenon of the Total Environment, which is also the name of a paper written by a collective of authors led by Roberto and institutionally supported by the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, which is based in Klosterneuburg in the outskirts of Vienna. This paper was published earlier this year, 2021, by the journal Science of the Total Environment. It is an open access publication, so you are welcome to Google its title and you will be able to freely download it. And hence, I would also like to provide you with a little bit of context about this session in order to diminish the disciplinary and also geographical and institutional distance between the audience and the speakers. The best way to do it, I think, would be to speak a few words about the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, the so-called KLI, which is an independent center of advanced studies in the life and sustainability sciences. It exists since 1990 and is named after the Nobel Prize winner, Austrian zoologist and philosopher Konrad Lorenz, who is sometimes referred to as the father of ethology, which is a scientific study of animal behavior under natural conditions and also from an evolutionary perspective. So the KLI offers resident and visiting fellowships and fellowship programs for late-stage PhD students, postdocs, and senior researchers working on conceptual and formal research, as well as philosophical and historical work addressing broad and interrelated questions about life. Its mission is to enable scientific reasoning that can contribute to understanding and sustaining life in its biological, cognitive, social, and cultural diversity. The KLI community is also committed to addressing pressing challenges of our time through inter and transdisciplinary research in the natural and social sciences, philosophy, history, and social studies thereof. So the KLI is also involved with publications such as the Vienna series in theoretical biology and the Journal Biological Theory. And it also holds events like the weekly KLI colloquia, which are open to all in its current virtual mode. So after this somewhat long comment and introduction, I will start the introduction of our first presenter, Roberto. Then Guido will follow, and after that, I will also make my own comments and remarks, and finally, we can take some questions from the chat. So let me introduce you, Roberto Gatti. He's an Italian environmental and evolutionary biologist, also a biodiversity expert who studies the diversity, behavior, evolution, and ecology of species. He holds a PhD in tropical forest ecology from the University of Tuscia, Italy, and has recently been appointed the associate professor at the Unilassal Polytechnic in Rouen, France. Previously, he held a position as associate professor in biodiversity at the Biological Institute of the Tomsk State University in Russia. He was also a senior research fellow at the KLI, where I had the pleasure to meet him. A research associate at the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University, and a visiting professor at the Beijing Forestry University. So his research deals with different shades of biological, environmental, and behavioral diversity, as well as with global environmental protection. He's an expert in evolutionary and conservation biology, ecophysiology of animals and plants, especially applied to climate change biology, and also theoretical and experimental ecology. He also works as a freelance documentary photographer and wildlife filmmaker, coordinating geographic and scientific explorations in some of the most remote places on Earth. In 2019, his documentary film on the biodiversity of the forests in the Congo River Basin was released, entitled Ivindo, A Journey into the Green Heart of Africa. He has published several guidebooks, a novel essay book, academic textbooks in English, Italian, and Russian, and photographic books. In addition, Roberto is a promoter of an integrated approach to economics and ecology, having founded the Society for Economological Studies in 2011, and also serving up to 2015 as the editor-in-chief of an international scientific journal called Economology Journal. So I'm pretty sure that you are curious enough by now, and then I give you Roberto Gatti.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. You know, you great expectations about that. I hope to be entitled of that. I will share my screen. So please let me know if you can hear me well at the beginning, and if you can see my screen well. Okay, I'm sharing it. Okay. Can you see it? Can you hear me well? Can you give me confirmation of that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you for this great introduction. I will try to explain and to introduce the topics we are talking about today, that are mostly related to the loss of diversity that somehow led to the emergence of what we are now calling a pandemic. And of course, this diversity loss has several aspects to be considered that actually brought everything, all the elements that we now are facing and that we are now seeing, that contributed all together to create the conditions for the emergence of this pandemic. So our talk is divided in three parts. I will take care of the first part, so talking about diversity and niche emergence. Then Guido will follow me and we'll talk about the loss of diversity, pandemics, and the responsibility of science. And then Marco will provide some concluding remarks about looking ahead on this topic. So let's start with my first part about diversity and niche emergence. I'd like to introduce a physical concept that is interesting because is very well known about the laws of thermodynamics. That is that nothing is created, nothing is destroyed, and everything transforms. This is strictly related to evolutionary ecological processes, but also to what we are now seeing as a socio-economic problem that is called COVID. Because this virus that actually created the conditions around itself to block and to put in lockdown almost all people around our planet, is not created, is not destroyed, but it actually transforms from something that we really know very well. And now we will see why we know it. Anyway, you can see that even Sir Julian Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog, because he was always taking the defense of Darwin, used this concept now for evolutionary processes that he saw as a directional and essentially irreversible processes that gives an increase of variety and a higher level of organization in products. So it's a single process of self-transformation. And using the words of Lee Margulis, the American biologist, life forms can be considered as a island of order in an ocean of chaos. The problem is that if we bring this chaos within this island of order, of course, we are in some ways disturbing the system. And if we disturb the system, then we have the consequences that we are now having. So we need to consider life not a machine. The first important thing is that we are now realizing, after years of mechanical reasoning, that life is not like a machine. So Fritjof Capra, the author of The Web of Life, defined life in a very holistic way, and he said that the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. This is why we started, as Marco introduced, this discussion around the science of total environment, because we need to have an interconnection and an interdependent way of considering the current phenomena. To well understand what is the role of species in the environment, we need to differentiate from the habitat, that is the place where the organism lives. And in this case, for instance, the virus lives in the habitat that is our own body. But niche is only actually the role that the animal and the plants and every organism and even microorganism plays in that place. So we don't need to confound, no, to mix up the idea of habitat and the idea of niche, because niche is a role. And ecological niche is strictly connected to a concept that in economics is well known, the concept of latent market. Because niches can be defined as fundamental or realized, because the fundamental niche in the Atkinsonian way of considering a niche is the potential space that each species can occupy. No? The realizing niche is the actual space in these different kind of roles that the species have in their own environment, that the species actually realize effectively. So when we consider the niche concept, we need to remember this. And everybody knows that if we want to really understand the role of species in their environment, we need to take care of the competitive exclusion principle. The competitive exclusion principle was the basic idea according to which no two species can occupy the same niche. So if this was the principle, of course, you easily realize that we couldn't have so many species on our planet. We should have very dominant species that can occupy the biggest niche possible, and we have a very limited diversification. In nature, what happens is that the phenomenon, the process of niche partitioning leads to diversification. So instead to have species continuing their competition and their exclusion, because of course they cannot live in the same niche, they diversify their niche with partitioning. And these are very simple examples. Birds, for instance, these are warblers. Warblers diversify the kind of space within the same tree they live. So imagine a tree top like this. Now there are species that live on the extreme top other species that live on mid-level, other that live on the external part, and some others in the internal part. But the result is that at least 5 species, 5 different species, even if they almost have the same fundamental niche, can occupy a coexistent realized niche. So they live on the same tree. Similar things happens with, for instance, bumblebees. Bumblebees can forage on the same meadows, but because they have a different preferred floral length, no, the length of the corolla is different. Even if the species can use all of them, but they separate, so they partition. This is the concept of niche partition. They partition the niche. You have several other examples. I cannot mention all of them, but one of the most famous is the Darwin finches. Darwin finches that in different islands of Galapagos live together, but changing the beak length, the beak size, they can use different kind of food. So they can stay together even in a small island, but having a build depth that allows the use of different kind of food, so the coexistence on the same place. So this is the way nature coexists. The problem is that niche partitioning is a very simplistic view and static and doesn't take into consideration the different relationships species can have. So we developed during the last years the idea of niche emergence and expansion, because this really well captures and represents the feedback, the dynamic feedback that diversity gives on diversity. So this is very well connected to the economic concept of the theory of the agent possible, because this theory explains very well how market, and so in the economic system, and how biodiversity in the ecological system can really expand. So to consider how biological diversity evolved, that is the diversity of species that we have on our planet, and this is why we are talking about diversity lost, because we have from one side the evolution of diversity, and from the other side one species, namely us, that are destroying this diversity and are creating the conditions for the emergence of pandemics. So biodiversity follows different ways to evolve. One is the principle of autopoiesis. The other one is that biodiversity is autocatalytic. Biodiversity can also be considered three-dimensional and fractal. So overall, biodiversity is an emergent phenomenon. And you can have an example of autocatalytic and autopoietic system in this picture, in this drawing of drawing ends. So one end is drawing the other one. In nature, for instance, that would allow the growth of other plants. Three-dimensionality, that is very evident, for instance, in a forest. When you look up and you see how the structure and different layers of forest can overlap, and fractals that are well known, for instance, in the broccoli, in cauliflowers, where you see that these iterating structures that reproduce themselves in smaller and smaller parts. So let's go a bit inside the topic, and if you see, and if we imagine we reduce almost 570 million years in just 1 hour, so all the life evolution is compressed in 1 hour. You will see that after the first hour, the first fish, so the first vertebrate, almost evolved in a water environment. Then, after 2 hours and a half, we had the first plant, terrestrial plant. And we had to wait for about 8 hours to see the first mammal. The first mammal on Earth, the first mammal on terrestrial environment. And here we are. So just a few minutes before the end of the hour. So what I'm trying to say is that with or without us, the evolution of life wouldn't change much. So our role on this planet is relevant because, of course, we created several interesting things. We discovered the laws of physics. We could travel in the space, in the outer space. We created the arts, the pyramids. But for the rest of life, our presence is very irrelevant. And if you consider this, that's very nice representation of the spiral of life, this helicoid representation. And you can see that for most of the time, for most of the spires of this vortex, life is absent. Up to the Cambrian period, when we had the explosion of life, we couldn't consider that there was proper life on our planet, except from some protocells, But the Cambrian period was the explosion of diversity on our planet, and we actually are located at the end of these lives in the Holocene epoch. So the Quaternary period is the period where we evolved on this planet, and in this part of the time, now you see that is actually the last slice of the spiral, the last point on the evolutionary vortex. This again reminds us our minimal role on this planet. And let's start considering the four main characteristics of biodiversity and processes with which biodiversity evolves. The first one is that biodiversity is autopoietic. Autopoietic is a system that is capable of reproducing and maintaining itself. So we have sources of energy, matter, and messages that are combined and interconnected with different components in a system that are closed, but to the elements, but open to the matter and the energy. So at the end, we have a release of a sort of entropy, that is energy that we release. And this idea that life and biodiversity itself can be considered an autopoietic system starts from the idea that the realization of living, promoted by Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana in their book, is a self-determining, self-reproducing, and self-restructuring process. From a theory that I was recently proposing, that's called biodiversity-related niche differentiation theory, we see that if we have a system that is not very much autopoietic, so if we have very few elements, it means very low diversity, the source of energy can somehow be used by the system. So this is part B of this picture, and the environment takes most of them, takes most of the energy, but the diversity at the end is limited, so the entropy. If the system is more diverse, so there is a relationship between the environment, the external environment, and the elements that are composing this system, and the diversity at the end is higher, and the entropy is higher. So the theory what says that the theory says that the more the diversity, the higher the biodiversity. So you need in a sort of autocatalytic system that we are going to see to consider this process of expanding the space that we have, like a tree. Imagine a tree where the roots are the first species, then we have the trunk with the bark that is the keystone species, the fundamental species, and then the branches that are all the other species that expand the available niche. Like in a desert, imagine that if you have one tree that is growing in a desert, this provides several other niches for many other species. So instead to have a very limited ecological niche, then you have a more expanded niche. This is why biodiversity is extremely relevant, and this is why biodiversity is also autocatalytic, because species themselves create favorable conditions for the colonization of other species. And so in this way, they allow the concurrent presence, and the fundamental mechanism that is actually supporting this is the diversity related niches. So as in a very simple autocatalytic system, no, this comes from chemistry. In chemistry, if you have two molecules, A and B, these molecules interact and catalyze the formation of other molecules that are B and A that somehow auto-catalyze the system. So are the same two molecules that in a continuous circle can auto-catalyze themselves. And if you look at the autocatalytic process, the autocatalytic process in chemistry is a process that speeds up the reactions. No, the reactions can occur faster and with less energy. So the same can be said in evolutionary processes. In evolutionary processes, what is the catalyst? The catalyst is the species themselves. Because in an evolutionary process or in an evolutionary view of the autocatalysis of biodiversity, species can increase the biodiversity acting as catalyst. So a speciation event can undergo autocatalysis, so can be autocatalytic. So what does it mean? It means that we have the property of autopoiesis, the property of autocatalysis. This gives us an idea of the importance of biological diversity. I like to say sometimes also to my students that if you can imagine other planets with life and you find one species on this other planet, of course you will find, that's like a must, you will find other species, because it cannot exist a planet with only one species. Because if there is a species, there is the need to have diversity. If there is no diversity, it's impossible to have only one extremely dominant species, even human beings. This is why we cannot survive on other planets like Mars, for instance, without carrying some other species with us that can be microorganisms or even plants. We are unable to survive alone. So this explains very well that there are processes that are implied in this vision that is a virtualistic formulation of natural laws that is based on cooperation, on facilitation, on the avoidance of competition, and not on competition alone, as typical in the market system or in the ecological systems, in the classical view of them, actually. There are processes like niche displacement and niche emergence that I'm introducing now. The other important process and the property of biodiversity is that biodiversity is three-dimensional. This means that biodiversity creates the condition to occupy more of the niche available. And this is possible thanks to the fact that if the niches are three-dimensional, of course, more species can fit. So imagine a box. If you have a box, of course, you can put there more objects than if you had just a paper, no, a layer of paper. On a layer of paper, of course, you can have only bidimensional objects. On a box, you can have three-dimensional elements. And this, of course, is how biodiversity works. And we tested this theoretical idea with an empirical approach. We use the tree height, the canopy height around the world, and we fit this curve with the mean biodiversity index. And what we see that on planet, they fit very well. So the higher is the forest, the more plant you can have in that forest. So it means that this vertical expansion of diversity that evolved in our planet, no, during the different eras that plants lived on our planet and are now continuing evolving in that sense, they created the condition to host more species even in the same square meter. And this is something extremely interesting because we apply this concept. Now imagine our buildings. No, they grow in towards height, because we have skyscrapers, for instance, that actually are realized in ecological, following ecological ideas, no, that to use in a more efficient way the space. This is actually what nature is doing, and this is something that allows to have more biodiversity. The fourth fundamental process is that biodiversity is a fractal structure. Fractals are very popular since the a very interesting popularization of the Mandelbrot set, that is this one that you can see on the left bottom side of the slide. This is autocatalytic set. Now, the more you go, imagine you have a microscope and you zoom and zoom in, you see that the structure replicates itself. And in nature, several elements like the snowflake or the ferns of the broccoli, or the shell of mollusks, for instance, Nautilus is one of the most famous example, reproduce themselves in a very iterating way. And biodiversity has this possibility. I won't go into details of that, but there is a way to explain the higher diversity that we find in the tropics instead of, for instance, the Arctic zones, that is related to the idea that biodiversity is a sort of fractal cauliflower. It means that if we consider the box, the niche that I explained before, as a box, where we can fit with more species the space available. Of course, if we have a higher fractal dimension, so a higher 3-dimension, we can put there more elements. These elements are species that can coexist in the same environment altogether. And this is the way nature can really host the diversity that we see on our planet. Everything connects and summarized in this concept that biodiversity is an emergent property. We developed this after the reasoning about the autopoietic, autocatalytic, 3-dimension and fractal dimension of biodiversity. So we consider that biodiversity is something that actually emerged because niches don't only partition, as we said, but also emerge, because niche partitioning is only one side, one face of the medal. The other side is that niche can actually emerge under our eyes, and this emergence is fostered, is triggered by the presence of species by themselves. So like in these geometrical figures, you can see that actually the expansion of the volume, of the basal volume, that actually in the partitioning process can be only divided in smaller and smaller parts, but with the emergence can actually expand. So we have an additional possibility for diversity to evolve and to expand, of course. The problem, let's call it the problem, is that because of that, we are changing our way of seeing evolution, of seeing ecosystem and ecology, because we thought, okay, there would be a way to predict evolution, to predict ecological processes. But actually, if we consider that niche emergence is one of the most important processes in ecology, we need to realize and to confirm ourselves that this is a very unpredictable process. An example is this one that we first time provided about an autocatalytic system that created the condition for niche emergence. Consider the very well-known example of aphids and ladybugs and ants that everybody knows, no? So originally, during the evolution of aphids, aphids were just feeding on bacteria. So they were using their feeding ability to eat bacteria. At a certain point, after a certain delta time, so it means evolutionary time, 1,000 or even centuries, but in any case, evolutionary time. So at a certain point, aphids had the ability to feed on bacteria, but these bacteria, instead to be digested, became symbiotic. Becoming symbiotic, they lived in the gut of aphids and opened up a new possibility for aphids to utilize and to metabolize somehow the plant sap. So aphids could actually use something that is a substance very poor in proteins and other vitamins, but very rich in sugar. So this opened another niche, another potential niche, because the niche of aphids using plants was closed at the time where aphids were only feeding on bacteria. So this relationship, so the bacteria were in some ways catalyzing the reactions between the aphids and the plants. But what happened? That the plant had to defend themselves, from the attack, and this is something that in agriculture is very common. Aphids attack plants. They can actually, if they are in a very high number, they can damage plants. So to avoid the damages, plants catalyze another reaction. They are able to attract what? To attract the biological enemy of aphids, that are ladybugs. Ladybugs are the main predators of aphids. So plants catalyze the reaction. This is a predation, actually. So the predator, that is the ladybug, predate the prey. So this opened up an additional niche. But because the predation itself has to find a way, an equilibrium, otherwise, of course, the prey will be too low and the predator will be too high. So abundant predators cannot survive with very few prey. So what happened? That aphids catalyzed a new reaction with ants. So they attract the ants. How? They use the part of the plant sap and the sugar that they take from the plants to create this very honeydew, this called honeydew, that is actually a sugar that is produced by the aphids and provided to the ants. So ants go there, suck this sugar produced by the aphids, and at the same time, as a sort of mutualism, they defend the ants from the attack of the ladybugs. So you see that the ants also are part of a system that is an autocatalytic system made of 5 different species. But the idea, after all this description of the evolutionary process that allow the expansion and the emergence of new niches that were not present at the time where aphids were only feeding on bacteria, what is the story? What is the main idea of this story? Is that we are very we have no many ways to predict all this evolution. Why we cannot predict? Because the expansion and the niche emergence is actually almost unpredictable. Even if the question could be, okay, so in this way we can predict something in evolution. Is there anything that we can predict in evolution? Not much, but at least there are similar patterns that we can use. For instance, coevolution. This is a typical example. The orchid that you see on the right side, the Angrecum sesquipedale, was discovered by Darwin, that suggested and predicted, so it was a correct prediction, that there must be an insect with a very long proboscis, so with a very long feeding apparatus, able to go inside this very long ovarium of the orchid and suck the nectar that is inside. And after centuries, there was a discovery of this moth that is called Xanthophan morgani, that is able to, because you see it has this very long proboscis, is able to feed on this orchid. A similar pattern that can be predicted in evolution is the coevolution and the parallel evolution of placentals and marsupials on different parts of the world. Now, you know that marsupials live in Oceania, and they have, anyway, even if they had no close history, evolutionary history, so the phylogenetic patterns were very different, between marsupials and placentals, but for the marsupials, the shape are very close and very similar to those of the placentals because they occupy in a different continent similar niches. So you see that something can still be predicted in evolution. Anyway, most of the processes that we saw are unpredictable. So the question, the relevant question is that most of these niche emergence also in economy is quite unpredictable. Imagine the invention of computer. No, personal computer were a great revolution. Sorry, were a great revolution in our economy and in our technology. But when the first Apple, for instance, the first Mac appeared in the market, who could have imagined that also mouses, that also joysticks, DVD, or even eBay and Amazon would have emerged? So this was the unpredictable side of niche emergence in economy as well. And from all these considerations, there is a question, a main question that comes to us: how we can address a sustainable future if we cannot predict what's going on? If we can predict the future of the economic and even biological niches that are emerging even during our lifetime. So these are two jokes, no, two cartoons about the intelligent design, but if we were really able to address a sustainable future, we shouldn't do what is depicted in these cartoons. And all of these ideas on niche emergence and the parallel with the evolution of biodiversity was summarized in this paper that we developed with theoretical biologists and economists about the cambio diversity and this new theory on the emergence of ecological and economic niches. So just to summarize, we saw that evolution is autocatalytic, so it's a sort of network of interacting agents enabling each other. It's ramifying, so it's three-dimensional, it's fractal, so there are branching processes that ramify this diversity, and it's creative because, of course, new forms can really be produced endlessly. And if we want to consider a parallel between economic system and ecological system, we see that during evolution we had this Cambrian explosion of life. During the Cambrian period, we had this really high number of new species that evolved on planet. And at the same time, in a parallel way, during the Industrial Revolution, we had this cambio diversity, the so-called cambio diversity, where several goods appeared on our planet because they, of course, evolved thanks to this emergence of the economic niche. And for the indigenous people, for instance, the Yanomami in South America, they almost know about 300 goods. But in New York City, this is a typical example, a barcode, there are at least 10 billion goods. So you see, the explosion was extremely impressive at a certain point. This is, for instance, the global GDP per capita from about 2,000 years ago and nowadays. So the arrow shows you the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution was the shifting time. And this is the time where all autocatalytic systems, so this is a typical shape, a typical pattern. If you also look at microbial evolution, for instance, you have exactly the same curve. There is a point in the curve where the autocatalytic processes explode. And of course, the diversity, in this case, the global GDP, increases so much in an exponential way. So now we have an important question to answer. Can we conserve something that explodes, emerges, and actually changes so constantly? We had 5 mass extinctions during the Phanerozoic. All of them were caused by geological events, meteorites, explosion. volcanoes, eruptions, none of them, like the one that is ongoing, was caused by a single species. But now our species in the Quaternary today is causing the 6th mass extinction on our planet. So the important question is how we can conserve this that is continuously changing, how we can address a sustainable future if we cannot predict much. So this is why we should care about extinctions, because extinctions can be a sort of autocatalytic domino effect, no? Like in the game, the domino. Of course, if you touch a piece, all the others will fall down. And in ecology, we have this concept that was developed also after several experiments, for instance, like with the starfish. If you remove the keystone species, the keystone in the arc, in architecture, is the most important stone. If you remove the stone, all the arc will fall down. And the same is with several keystone species, like the pisaster starfish in the marine environment, in the marine ecosystem. If you remove these species, you lose almost half of the other species that live in that ecosystem. Like for the beavers, in the case of beavers, if you remove the beavers, they are ecological engineers. All the ecosystem, the pond they create, disappears. And the several species that are coexisting in that environment also disappear. So we should care about extinction, because if we touch one piece, so if we remove even one species, we can have an autocatalytic domino effect. And biodiversity actually is very important for us, because biodiversity is what produces what the so-called ecosystem services. Ecosystem services that are different kinds of services, for instance, food, water, cleaning, energy, and many other things. So many benefits, regulating services also, are damaged and are very threatened by the extinctions that we saw. If you just have a look at the Living Planet Index, explain the loss of diversity on our planet. And you see that from 1970 up to now, we have a very big loss of diversity of species, mostly in the freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environment. So in almost all the environment that we know. And why this happened? This happened for several causes. For instance, destruction of habitat, the most important one. The biodiversity loss that we had in Southeast Asia due to forest deforestation and palm oil plantation is huge. And this really threatened most of the species living in Southeast Asia. In the marine environment, the vessels that we used in 1850 were smaller and very few in number. Now we have big boats fishing everywhere, and of course this reduces very much the diversity of our sea environment. Why all of this happened? This happened because of the extinction vortex. So the population becomes smaller and smaller, and becoming smaller and smaller, of course, there is this process of interbreeding. So the genetic diversity is lost. And if we lose the genetic variability, of course, we have higher mortality and smaller populations. And what we have done so far with our industrial revolution is increasing the diversity of goods, but decreasing the diversity of species. And if we lose diversity, we create the conditions to pathogens emergence, to zoonotic emergence. Again, a quote to meditate on by Jared Diamond. Because we are the cause of our environmental problems, we are the ones in control of them, and we can choose to stop causing and start solving them. The future is up for grabs, lying in our own hands. The problem is that we are not doing this. We are doing exactly the opposite. And that's why some authors, for instance, proposed a very wonderful vision of a world without human beings. Some others, of course, say a world without human beings is a very sad world. But as Wolfgang Sachs said, nothing is ultimately as irrational as rushing with the maximum efficiency in the wrong direction and expanding our population in this very exponential way. We are creating this condition to use more planets than we actually have available. We are nowadays using more than 1.5 planets. If we continue with the business as usual, so with this continuous over exploitation of the resources of our planet, and so with the diversity loss that we are seeing during the last at least 2 centuries, what we are expecting is that we will need to use 2 planets, but actually we don't have a second planet. So the only way is to reduce our ecological footprint and come back to the 1 planet footprint that we have used so far. But in 1950, we were mostly using natural energy. The problem is that now, instead of eating the sun, we are eating the oil, the fossil fuels, because we use fossil fuels to produce 99% of our food. And this is a big problem because this creates the conditions, it recreated the condition for climatic changes. You can see the temperature anomaly from 20,000 years ago and predicted to 2,100. So in less than 50, 70 years, we would have temperature anomaly that is very emerging, let's say, from the preconditions that we put in place. And this is why, and I'm going to the end of my part, to the conclusion of my part, this is why creating and reducing diversity, biological diversity, but also geological diversity, and extracting more resources that we had, and overexploiting marine and terrestrial environment, overexploiting species, wild species, so putting together in this market pangolins and bats and snakes, and keeping them alive in small cages. So using life in the wrong way created the conditions to the emergence of the current COVID pandemic. So the SARS-CoV-2, this virus, that is the virus responsible of the epidemic that now is a pandemic, is a virus that was always living in wildlife. The problem is that if we mix up things, if we destroy the equilibrium that took thousands of years to evolve in an ecosystem, of course we create disequilibrium, we create the preconditions for zoonotic emergence. And the global environmental health is something that we must take into consideration, that we must consider, because the environmental health, we could consider ourselves like the doctors of the planet, of course, are aspects of the general socio-economic processes that are involved in this pandemic. For instance, lockdown was a measure. So the lockdowns that were taken around the world were measured to try to stop in the short term the evolution of the virus, the evolution of the pandemic. But lockdown was also damaging economic aspects of our life. Shops were closed, people couldn't travel, tourism had to stop. All of them depends on the wrong use we had on our planet. So this is a global environmental issue. This is why we have to consider all the loss of diversity that we have seen so far, and the processes that can actually allow diversity that we are blocking now as a relevant problem of our time. So that's why we pushed very much the public opinion to reconsider the importance of wildlife conservation, of biodiversity protection, because the emerging zoonoses are the results of the bad conservation we had of wildlife in several parts of the world. And I thank you for the attention. And with this, I will give the floor to Guido. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Roberto. That's a lot to process, a lot of food for thought. I will have some comments. In the end, I'll go ahead and introduce you to Guido Caniglia, who is the scientific director now of the KLI, actually since 2018. Previously, he held a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship in the Faculty of Sustainability at the Leuphana University of Lüneburg in Germany. He also earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Florence in 2010, and a second PhD, this time in biology, from the Center for Biology and Society at Arizona State University in 2016. In parallel with his second PhD, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher and project manager for the Global Classroom Project, a transnational partnership between Arizona State University and Leuphana, engaging curriculum reform for higher education for sustainable development. In a time when most efforts go into the one-sided production of data, Guido's work aims to shape epistemological and theoretical frameworks that contribute to ongoing scientific developments, especially in fields such as evolutionary developmental biology, sustainability science, and higher education for sustainable development. In his research, Guido studies how experimental and theoretical practices contribute to produce evidence and knowledge about complex phenomena of transformation, from evolutionary transitions in the history of life, such as the evolution of social behavior, to purposeful transformations towards sustainability in our contemporary world, for example, socio-ecological and socio-technical innovations. So Guido, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Marco. Thanks a lot for this introduction. Thanks to the organizer for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to an audience also that actually I think neither myself nor Roberto are very used to talking to, and so we're looking forward to hearing what the reactions are in the end. I will keep it pretty short, and I will depart in a way from where Roberto left with his presentation, and so with the understanding of evolution as well as biodiversity that Roberto provided us with, I will go into some of the work that we did and that Marco mentioned already in trying to a bit framing then the connection between the pandemic, diversity, and differences of the total environment. And this is the diversity lost idea. And then I will actually the main part of the talk will be relying on two recent publications that we did on the implications of all this for the science system. Meaning, if the pandemic emerged in this way and we were not able to deal with it either scientifically properly or socially, what do we learn from this event? And what do we need to change? This is a bit the main question in a way. So what are the implications of of everything that happened for the future, especially of science? As Marco mentioned, my interest as a philosopher of science, historian of science, is in understanding how science works, how knowledge is produced, and trying to figure out how to do it better. And the pandemic, with all the failures that surrounded it, both in understanding it and in dealing with it, is a great example. It's a great way of reflecting on the kind of knowledge that we are producing in science, and maybe of the kind of institutions and the kind of knowledge that we should be producing at this point, in the mid of what Roberto reminded us, in the mid of this sixth extinction and climate emergency situation. So in a way, the pandemic seems to be also a call for, or raising the question, are we doing the things that we should be doing also in science, or is there something that we should be changing? This graph is a bit, I think, it's a graphical abstract of our paper, and summarizes a bit what Roberto has presented you with in a bit more an easier and more intuitive way, right? So the diversity in the middle, so a property of the biosphere, the geosphere, and the anthroposphere, which and the anthroposphere being the place where change has been created, mainly in the history of life, at least since Homo sapiens evolved, and that has had a great impact both on the geosphere and the biosphere, specifically on diversity in the anthroposphere, geosphere, and biosphere, leading to a loss of diversity, and therefore, as Roberto concluded, also as one of the implications to the emergence of the COVID pandemic, and actually of many others. We are, according to most parasitologists, zoologists, biodiversity experts, and experts of evolution, we are in the middle of a pandemic emergency. And think about the swine flu, think about many other, think about the HIV, hepatitis, and many other epidemics and pandemics. And we are now realizing the importance of this, because COVID has put the whole system to its knees. But in the end, this is not only about COVID. This is another representation also from the paper of these interdependencies that, again, Roberto has detailed and explained to us in terms of emergence, evolution, unpredictability. And in the lower part, you see also in this case what Roberto just mentioned in terms of time, right? And it's these arrows at the bottom tell us how long it took to create the kind of diversity that we have on Earth, from geochemical diversity to biological diversity to biocultural, cultural, anthropological diversity, right? Here we talk about cultures, we talk about, and as Roberto also briefly mentioned, there is also not only a loss of biodiversity in terms of species, there is also a strong loss connected of biocultural diversity of traditions, cultures, kinds of knowledge, ways of being, ways of understanding the world that we are experiencing in this in the current world. And the just a couple of things about this diagram, just because it's, I think, pretty iconic. The fact that these spheres are closely interconnected, and that there is this constant feedback loops between what happens in one and what happens in the other. And this is a dimension that has been pretty absent from the public discourse on the current pandemic. We rarely hear talking about the COVID pandemic in terms of its connection to biosphere, geosphere, and the whole anthroposphere, in the sense of our way of living, our way of producing, our way of thinking, our way of behaving. And so this diagram captures in a simplistic way, but still trying to embrace the complexity and emergence that Roberto was talking about, this phenomenon. And the fact that if you start reading it from the anthroposphere, that the anthroposphere affects what happens in the biosphere and the geosphere in terms of with these blue arrows, and then this loss of diversity with the black and the white arrow feeds back into the anthroposphere, which also then creates the emergence of this pandemic, which has then feedbacks into the features, characteristic properties of the other sphere, and especially on their diversity. So this is, in a way, a summary related to the pandemics of this whole relationship between diversity and this total environment. So all these interconnected spheres and dimensions. And it's also a very co-evolutionary approach. So looking at how one system and its parts evolve and changes in relation to the others, because none of these systems, none of these spheres can be understood unless one puts them in relationship to the other. And how did we deal with this? Very poorly, right? This is from yesterday. In Nature, there was this report, May 12, 2021. The WHO issues this first sort of like report, and the image from, unfortunately, from Brazil is from the article in Nature, and the WHO admitting the failure of being able to deal with the pandemic, and going back especially to what happened in February 2020, so about more than a year ago, when the pandemic first was sort of like transitioning from an epidemic to a pandemic, the inability of our state governments as well as intergovernmental organizations to deal with it and to make decisions and act upon it. So here it's interesting because the failure is framed in terms of communication breakdown, right? Communication breakdown among the WHO, national leaders, and the public caused the pandemic to explode. And so it is in this, it's clearly in the interconnection between these different scales, right? Between what nations did, what international organizations did, that the problems emerge, but also the public, the misunderstandings and the lack of understanding that we had, the most of the world population had, of what was going on. So if we look at now, what is this COVID-19 teaching us, right? This big failure that that the world has faced. What is it teaching us? And here I'll go with some reflections on what I was mentioning. The Nature frames it in terms of lack of communication. It's weaknesses in coordination at all scales, and therefore the urgent task to rebuild coordination frameworks across scales, from the individuals to institutions within specific countries, across country, and regain the trust needed for these kind of organizations to work effectively. And here I go a bit into the science system issue, because the word of science is one system among these many systems that have contributed and have failed to address the pandemic. Science is not what an individual scientist does. Science is a system of institutions that historically develops and changes over time, and that it has its injustices, its positive aspects, and so on and so on. And it's the social system of science that the pandemic invites us to rethink. But also because there is three aspects of science, of the word of science, that are important to keep in mind, because science can also become an example for other systems of how to deal with global futures, global issues, global systemic risks, such as the pandemic, because science is a system that operates globally in coordinated ways with a highly distributed governance structure. Think about the different universities, the different institutions, research centers that are coordinated and interconnected. It's an adaptive system, evolving in light of new challenges constantly, depending on new technologies, like from big data to artificial intelligence to new ways of knowing, open access and open data. Science adapts. It's a system among these many others. It's one of the systems in the anthroposphere, right? And that and therefore co-evolves with all the other ones. And it's also a collaborative and international intercultural system. Now, if these are the features that make potentially science interesting for leading the way, there's many things that should be changed in the world of science. And these, I'll conclude, are all related to the lack of diversity in the science system. And here we came up with 3 principles that we think should lead reform in the science system in order for this system to be able to address in the future these pandemics or other global risks. First and foremost, diversify theoretical and experimental approaches, inter and transdisciplinary research. We are still living in a world where disciplines dictate the schedule and the way in which science and knowledge is produced. Knowledge produced by disciplines is essential. It turns out is totally, it's not enough to understand the complexity of global risks, the global phenomena such as the pandemic that we're dealing with. Second principle, diversify and reward different ways in which science connects to society. We have an academic system that only supports a certain kind of academic career, which is the research scientist who publishes and somehow teaches, often very poorly, because that's also not rewarded. And that's the kind of science and scientific career that is that is rewarded, to the point that when we have to deal with an emergency such as COVID, there is an incredible lack of capacities, of abilities to communicate what science discovers to the public, but also a total incapacity to understand from the side of science what the public is asking for. And so scientific careers in scientific communication, fostering the ability to have scientists who can collaborate and work in decision-making context, in policy context, so-called also transdisciplinary research. So these are major changes that need to happen and that COVID is asking us to make happen if the world of science wants to live up to these expectations. Third and final, again, another diversification call, diversify voices and perspective in the science process. The world of science is still overwhelmingly monopolized by Western global North institutions and voices. And it is more and more clear that this is not enough. When it comes to global problems that require often local solutions that differ from context to context, having only one perspective, one kind of perspective on what is going on is not going to be enough. It's going to be very ineffective. and which means the system of injustice, which is often based on colonialism, racism, transphobia, that characterize the system of science as well, and which has recently, fortunately, been moved by from the Me Too movement to the Black Lives Matters movement, that are shaking also the system of injustice characterizing the world of science. This is also a call for diversifying, decolonizing, deracializing, degenderizing the science world, if we want this world to be able to generate knowledge that can that is fit for the purpose of these global and systemic challenges that have that level of unpredictability and uncertainty around them that also Roberto mentioned at the very beginning. So by no chance there is one shared topic across these principles, across these ideas of what needs to be changed in the science world, which is increasing diversity. So finding ways to navigate these challenges and create reforms and changes in the system that that sort of like foster the process of emergence, even in the scientific institutions, that can lead to diversify, to be able to monopolize and capitalize on these diversities. As a bit bold and final remark, just also to be a bit provocative, if it's true that science has a responsibility to contribute to making sure that something like this doesn't happen again, embracing diversity within the science system will be essential to achieve this goal, and it's pretty much up to us to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guido. So I'm going to allow myself to wrap up this conversation, and if we have time, then we can move on to maybe a few questions. Let me just, I'm going to share just 4 slides very quickly. So yeah, this is, I'm going to wrap this up, not from the standpoint of an expert on anything, but just to share some of the current discussions and conversations that are taking place at the KLI at this moment, sort of to give continuity to these conversations, to this project, to these papers, and these very important issues that we have shared with you today. So the diversity loss paper has, right towards the end, this passage. It says, scientific research needs to address the pandemic and its effects on human societies from the consideration that diversity is not only a value, but that it may also represent a solution. Sort of diversity in all its spheres, anthroposphere, biosphere, geosphere, posing as the cornerstone of sustainability. And so how do we move forward from now? It means, how do we halt or reverse trajectories of diversity loss in each and all of these spheres if we accept the premise that they lead to catastrophic scenarios? And I think that was pretty clear from the previous presentations by Roberto and Guido, the role that diversity plays, should be playing actually today in all forms of knowledge. So one of the hypotheses, it's not even framed as a hypothesis, and actually not a very strong one. We're not reinventing the wheel here, but we set out from the assumption that we need to move from corrective to preventive policy relevant frameworks and measures. So if we remember the feedback arrows on the paper's visual representation, I added these green thick arrows below to represent sort of negative feedbacks, to oppose these unstabilizing positive feedbacks that we see going from the anthroposphere to the biogeosphere and to the anthroposphere itself, because human diversity, cultural diversity are also aspects that are very important to a future that we want, a diverse future. So this sort of assumption comes from the fact that when dealing with uncertain, complex, and high-stakes issues, which are very core traits at the very core of the things that we are talking about, it is necessary to act proactively and systemically for maintaining life-supporting structures and processes, moving beyond emergent solutions to new problems. So, and I think that innovation systems, scientific knowledge, and knowledge as a whole is maybe for the Anthropocene, for the challenges that we are looking at, these emergent solutions to new problems just won't cut it anymore. So a proposal that we were thinking about would involve all sorts of things, of course, new technologies, social innovations, institutional arrangements, regulatory frameworks, but the contribution here would be to connect all them to this goal of regaining diversity by means of preventive systemic initiatives which arise from interdisciplinary frameworks. And of course, all these initiatives would entail alternative food systems, ecological restoration, rethinking human settlements, energy transition, social justice. So of course, this is a whole world of things to be reassessed. But what we are talking about here is this a sort of paradigmatic shift, if you will, or ways of thinking. And as an example, if you think about vaccines, of course, we rely completely on them and we are very pro-vaccines, don't get us wrong here. But if we see them as corrective measures or easy fixes, in the sense of initiatives or actions that react to previously unforeseen events and remains unobservant of future ones. So vaccines, they come and they, for instance, the COVID vaccine, as sometimes I get the feeling that people will, well, there's climate change, so there are a bunch of new viruses out there, so pandemics will be a recurrent thing in this century. And people might think that, oh, okay, but we can develop vaccines in 1-2 years, and that's sort of our modus operandi from now on. And that's very far from the truth, actually. There are many different viruses out there, and what has happened with the COVID vaccines, it does not apply to other things that might come our way. And if we contrast that with these preventive systemic initiatives or measures, for instance, the DAMA protocol, which is something associated with this so-called Stockholm paradigm. This is a book by Daniel Brooks and co-authors that give this new outlook on the relations between pathogens and hosts and how climate change will make the problem of emerging infectious diseases a lot worse. So the DAMA protocol is document, assess, monitor, and act. So sort of a huge network of knowledge building and trying to anticipate, monitor, and act upon what is coming our way. So this is what we're talking about. And other examples of these easy fixes would be geoengineering in the climate change discussion, right? Because it's just reacts to what's out there. If we spray the atmosphere with aerosols, we just don't know what's going to happen in terms of unintended consequences, especially for all kinds of diversity. So it just responds, and it remains oblivious to unintended consequences and what the future holds. Same goes for synthetic biology as a solution for biodiversity loss, as opposed to rewilding, ecological restoration, or preserving diversity, which is what this is all about. So to finish up this conclusion and maybe bring this closer to industrial economics and innovation, and I know that you have soon, within a few minutes, another session about innovation agenda. So my question to you would be sort of a provocation. What would an innovation agenda that supports such aims, that preserves all types of diversity, what does it look like, right? Is it able to anticipate and mitigate unintended consequences of technological development, right? And even a more concrete question would be, can national innovation systems accomplish all this and still foster globally competitive economies? So that's a huge question, but I think it goes to the core of discussions about an innovation agenda in the Anthropocene in the 21st century, right? And again, I'm not an expert, but I have been thinking about this, and I'm afraid that there might be some fundamental contradictions, because what we are looking for here is more, as Guido said, more cooperation, openness, in the way that we put our knowledge to use to solve global level problems like pandemics, climate change, pollution, social justice, and all that sort of thing. So if you think about, for example, intellectual property rights, right? We couldn't even break the patent for COVID vaccine. So if you cannot do even then, I mean, how is all the potential for new knowledge going to solve our problems, right? If we have this new amazing technology for like climate change adaptation or climate change mitigation, are we just going to hide it behind a paywall, a patent? So yeah, this was some of the questions. There are also other contradictions that might arise from between productivity, public goods, and scale issues, because we are talking about these spheres, right? The lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, anthroposphere, including science. And how does it all go along with productivity, efficient of innovation systems directed towards the private market? And scale issues also, because we're still locked into this Jevons paradox, right? The rebound effect, that we're getting more efficient and productive, but we are forgetting that even so, we are still encroaching upon natural limits, biophysical limits of nature. If you look at electric cars, we will never be able to swap all cars in the world from combustion engines to electric cars. So we need to think into detail about this sort of technologies that we have been putting out there. So what about local, open, intermediate knowledge technologies as a viable alternative, right? And for instance, epistemic diversity, what Guido was telling us about, comes into play here as well. Indigenous knowledge and all this potential that is actually now being suppressed by economic, political interests, biases, and how do we unleash all this potential for what Jürgen Wren, and this very inspired book called The Evolution of Knowledge, he argues for this new knowledge economy for the Anthropocene. And the knowledge economy should, as we have in the material economy, these flows of goods and services, production, distribution, consumption. If we have knowledge instead of goods and services, how does it look like? So the regulatory institutions that shape these flows. So we need to think about that in order that we can meet our challenges. So what he calls for is a bottom-up, openly accessible, collaborative knowledge production associated with the emergence of a collective subjectivity. So we have knowledge and institutions as the main engines for cultural evolution, and which also touches upon niche emergences, like Roberto told us. And this is all for the sake of a rational and realistic options and solutions. So I am going to leave you with that and maybe move on to some questions. Just a second. I'm going to stop sharing. So I'm going to read the questions here. This is from João Paulo Carvalho. No, actually, sorry, it is from Henrique Colseiro. One of the problems at the start of the pandemic was how the WHO and authorities generated mass panic when talking about the virus. But it was understandable given so few was known about it at the time. It's more of a comment than a question. Would either Roberto and Guido want to comment on that?
Yeah, I don't know if Guido has a...
Go, Roberto, and then I can interrupt. I mean,
no, I think that's just more a comment than a question. Of course, yeah. I won't say if correct or not. The thing is that this was the first time in our human history, something like that happened in a so huge scale. So panic was a reaction, sometimes too big, sometimes not so much. It should have something, somehow it should have been more stronger, I would say, because panic sometimes is a biological reaction that allows living beings to face something that could be actually dangerous. So maybe it's true that that was created by also international organizations, but imagine without this panic, what would have happened? So that's my thoughts about that. That's more a comment than actually a position on that.
I would also tend to agree. I think almost that what happened is that because of the economic loss that the measures such as lockdowns would have brought, there was no we were not ready enough. Like we didn't act promptly enough to what was going on, despite the fact that we didn't know exactly what actually this virus was and how it would work, which we do now. So yes, I think also some panic would have not. I tend to think that it would have been okay to act even more strongly in that context. I think, again, something that is more related to the role of science and scientists is the fact that the public is, I think, not used to dealing with the uncertainty that characterizes the scientific process. And that there is the expectation that science tells you right away what's right and wrong and what to do, whereas it takes time, it takes experiments, it takes figuring things out, and that's something that most of the people were not ready to accept, that we didn't know actually what was going on, and that therefore decisions had to be made relying on this ignorance and on the fact that science and scientists would have then figured things out on the go.
Well, thanks, Guido. Yeah, and if I might add something that I also took from Jürgen Renn's book, is this notion about dark knowledge and how there is a gap in terms of public knowledge that arises from all sorts of interests and biases. And we call it fake news now, but this misinformation is actually something that has been happening for a long time, not only in the pandemic and climate change, also back there in ozone layer and CFC, tobacco.
Yeah.
So yeah, this relationship between the public at large, scientists, authorities, it's very complicated, and it's something that's going to have to be dealt with if we want to make most of the potential for knowledge building, right, that we are supposed to have. And
an excellent example of this analysis being, as always, I always mention it, Naomi Oreskes' Merchants of Doubt, in relation to the tobacco industry and climate change, and how these truths about these facts were somewhat hidden for years and years, which led to not good consequences.
There is another comment here from within, which would be a word on the Amazon, the speed of destruction, but it's as a problem, and how much time do we have to stop that?
Yeah, that's a serious problem, I would say. even
also in the context of the sphere, so the biosphere and troposphere.
Yes, of course. No, that's that typical negative feedback that we can imagine. No, we didn't say much about positive and negative because we want to be, we didn't want to be
normative,
too direct and normative on that. But this is a typical example, and that's the destruction of Southeast Asia for palm oil, for instance. So the huge deforestation that is always characterized and involved the Amazon and Amazonian forest, and that now recently accelerated because of policy. The problem is that we need several years, decades, maybe centuries, to restore something that can be destroyed in a few years. So this is the typical situation that conservation biologists like me, for instance, face every time deal with problems like that. We can do whatever we want. We can try to develop new methods to monitor. We can try to restore. We can try to stop something. But if one politician is going in the wrong direction, you can completely wipe out everything that has been put in place with efforts of several people. So it's just one political choice that can really destroy everything that thousands of people around the conservation movement, around in general, even scientists involved. They couldn't even be in the biological sciences. They could be even in other kind of fields. But we have not so huge power compared to administrators of the public resources and natural resources in this case. So the destruction of Amazon is a tragedy in general, and can actually be considered one of the triggers of the emergence of these kind of global problems. So how much it lasts for that, I don't know. Nobody knows. But at this rhythm, not many years. And that's the very sad thing. So particularly in Brazil, you have the power to change this direction, and this is why we talk about, okay, it's unpredictable, but we can address, at least with good policy and with good politicians, these kind of things. And this comes from the general public. It can come from the wrong political action, of course.
Roberto, it's very interesting that you have just said that, because we have one final question and maybe just 1 minute for us to each respond to. And this is it. Wouldn't it be the case for a rupture, especially in institutional and political terms, in terms to rebuild what we need to do from what we have? Do we need a rupture?
Of course, that's
not an easy one.
Yes, that's a difficult. I leave to Guido this answer. It's a very difficult question.
Let's say my thinking is on ruptures, or is that reconnecting to that kind of unpredictability of evolution and of emergence that Roberto has explained to us. I think a rupture in this case, it's very dangerous, because we really have no idea what that can lead to. So I would rather call for fostering, cultivating democracy the way we know it. It's one of the best systems that we've ever had, I think, in terms of the representative democracy, trying to cultivate, trying to use the science system to cultivate that, trying to provide people of all genders with the education that can empowered and better decisions, better understandings. I think I know this is not the solution to the specific situation that we're experiencing now, but I do think that only by creating the conditions, only by creating a society that is able to dialogue, creating people that are able to think through the challenges of this time, that we're going to be able to survive it. I'm afraid my revolutionary times are lost back in time. So I think some more reformistic process could maybe help in this case. But this is my just personal opinion.
Yes, and as a final remark that builds on what Guido said, I think this is the time to be slower, less, and aim for quality and not quantity. That's the only solution. And this is not only an ecological aspect. This is actually an economic aspect.
Very well, very well. Well, yes, I think that your answers also touch upon another query that we have here, which would be the new direction of innovation for emerging infectious diseases. And it goes through diversity, right? Preservation of diversity, the things I've just said. And so, guys, thank you very much for your participation. We are 2 minutes to the end of the session. So Guido and Roberto, one more time, we really appreciate you being here with us. Within 15 minutes, there will be a session on innovation agenda. So I'll try to be there, yeah, and maybe pick up on these issues again.
Yes,
otherwise,
we address something to that.
Yeah. Otherwise, thanks everyone who have listened to us, organizers, and everyone participating in the conference. We really appreciate your presence tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation.
Yes. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks. Bye.
Good luck for the next section. That is very important now.
Good luck. Bye.
Bye.
Marco, are you switching directly? Hi.
Hello. Sorry, I would like to be at the beginning to say welcome to you, Roberto, Guido, and Marco. And now I am here to thank you very, very much. It was a terrific conference, and you did everything I dreamed that you could do.
Good.
You send a message for the next session, how we will think about innovation in this very broad and important and, let's say, life-saving discussion that you made. Thank you very, very much. And it's a pity that we have only less than 2 hours to discuss. And I said to Marco, who I thank for discovering these guys and bring them to Belo Horizonte, that we could later organize a workshop and discuss everything with time. And we would like to learn much more from you guys. Thank you.
But first we have to learn from you. So next time you're gonna have to talk.
Let's say positive feedback.
It's a positive feedback. Yes, we need to reinforce each other.
That's it.
Yeah, but cool. Thank you. That would be great. We can definitely organize. Also, like if you're interested through the KLI, something online with some people from the foundation. And the KLI, that's also like in the process of thinking that is going to happen. I think also led partially by Marco for this other paper that might be coming out. We can definitely join forces.